Right. Good question. Question was, do we start with I have a little dreidel? So Hanukkah's around the corner. Actually, funny you should mention that. Some people believe that resurrection of the dead kind of really took hold because of the stories of the Maccabees. But in any case, what we're going to be talking about tonight is Judaism and the afterlife, but specifically through the writings of one particular Jewish philosopher, sometimes considered one of the greatest Jewish philosophers in history, actually almost always considered one of the greatest Jewish philosophers in history. His name was Moses, the son of Maimon, Moshe ben Maimon in Hebrew, sometimes called Maimonides, which means son of Maimon, and sometimes called Rambam for the acronym Rav, Rabbi, Moshe ben Maimon, so Rambam. So we'll probably be calling him all these names through the course of the evening. So what does Judaism have to say about the afterlife? In the Bible itself, it doesn't say a lot. Very little is said. There are two somewhat explicit references to the idea of resurrection of the dead. One is found in the book of Isaiah, one is found in the book of Daniel. Other than those two, you also see resurrection of the dead found in the book of Ezekiel, but there it's really clearly a metaphor. For those of you who don't know about Ezekiel, he prophesies over a field of dead bones, calls them back to life, and so on. But that's clearly a metaphor, it's an image, and it's about the resurrection of the people of Israel in their homeland, not about physical resurrection of the dead. So that's what you see in the Bible. In the Talmud, Judaism is not just a religion about the Bible, it's a religion based on the interpretations and the oral tradition that was written down in the Talmud. And in the Talmud, you see many opinions about the afterlife. You see references to some kind of fiery punishment and torture. This kind of surprises a lot of Jews who don't think that Jews believe in hell, but you find that. And you also find stories about people feasting at a big banquet in the afterlife. And you also find perhaps references to a spiritual afterlife, and then you find references to a resurrection of the dead. So in all these different concepts, and unlike Christianity, for instance, which really systematically worked out what they believe, it's not systematic in the Talmud. It's a variety of different opinions, and there's no attempt to reconcile them or to present the material in any structured or organized way, I would say. So with this kind of background material, we then come to the 12th century and a man named Maimonides who studied Greek philosophy as a child. He lived at what we call the Golden Age of Spain. His early childhood was lived in the Golden Age of Spain when the Muslim world had translated Greek philosophy like Aristotle into Arabic. And so he grew up sort of inhaling that religion or that philosophy and adapted it to his own beliefs to fit with Jewish philosophy. And then his family had to leave Spain when some radical Islamic groups moved in. He first lived in Morocco and then went to Israel briefly and then ended up in Egypt. When he was 30 years old, he wrote 3 major works. When he was 30 years old, he wrote his first major work, and that was his commentary on the Mishnah, which is the basis of the Talmud. And that's the work that I'm going to be talking about. He did that when he was 30 years old. When he was about 45 years old, he wrote his major work of Jewish law called the Mishnah Torah. And again, he refers to ideas of the afterlife in there. And then in his later years, he wrote his philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed. Those are the 3 major works that he wrote. But since he was a world-famous scholar and philosopher, Jews all over the world were writing him questions. And so a large collection of his answers to these questions were also collected, and Rabbi Gelman will be looking at that. So let me introduce Rabbi Gelman. This is Rabbi Barry Gelman from United Orthodox Synagogues, who is joining me tonight. So what I'm going to do is present Maimonides' view of the afterlife as found in the commentary on the Mishnah, that first work he wrote when he was about 30 years old. And then we'll talk about the controversy that developed afterwards and some of his later writings, and Rabbi Gelman will present those. Hopefully everybody has the 2 handouts. You can see there's a lot of material there, so we're going to kind of try to go somewhat quickly through it. We're going to spend about 15, 20 minutes each talking about these two handouts, and then we can take questions. Okay, so everybody fast. Is there any questions so far? Everybody's good so far? Okay. So for those people who are watching this live stream, or we're also recording it, so if you watch it later, if you email me or write or comment on wherever you see this, we will get you a PDF file of the handout so you can follow along as you listen or watch. It is kind of important to read the material. I'm not going to read, obviously, all the material because there's too much here, but I did underline and outline and footnote everything, so I'll be pointing to the places that I marked up. What we're looking at first is the handout that says at the top, Isidore Twersky, a Maimonides reader, Berman House, 1972. Okay, everybody see that handout? And so that's where we're going to start. So, as I said, this is a commentary of Maimonides on the Mishnah. And so what you see in the box there on the left column, it says the Mishnah. This is the section of the Mishnah that he's commenting on. So the Mishnah says, this is the kernel of the Talmud, says the following: all Jews have a share in the world to come. By the way, in Hebrew, it's good to know the Hebrew terms for these. So world to come in Hebrew is olam haba, which literally means the world to come. Maimonides is going to understand that to mean a spiritual afterlife. So all Jews have a portion in the world to come, olam haba, but, you see the underlining, these have no share in the world to come. One who says that the resurrection of the dead is not taught in the Torah. And the other term you need to know in Hebrew is resurrection of the dead, which is techiyat hametim, right? Giving life to the dead. That's a technical term. It means your body is reconstituted and your soul gets put back into it. That's what the rabbis meant when they used that term. So if you don't believe in resurrection of the dead, you don't get olam haba. That could leave me out, by the way, but anyway. Number two, one who says that the Torah is not from heaven. And again, this can be interpreted different ways. If it's meant that God dictated word for word the Torah to Moses, who then wrote down exactly what he heard, I may be missing out on olam haba for that reason. And then the third is here described as the atheist, but the Hebrew word for atheist is apikoros. And so for those of you who have studied Greek philosophy, you may recognize the name. His Apikoros is a Greek philosopher from which we get the English word Epicurean, right? So why is Epicurean come to mean what it means? It's sort of in a very unfair way, his philosophy was eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? All there is is this life. There is no afterlife. And so you might as well enjoy it to the fullest. Hence, an Epicurean is one who enjoys the finer things in life. But that's what they meant there. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah says. Now Maimonides is going to comment on that. He says, I must now speak of the great fundamental principles of our faith. Know that the masters of Torah hold differing opinions concerning the good which will come to a person as a result of fulfilling the commandments, which God commanded us through Moses. As a consequence of their different understandings of the problem, they also have widely different opinions concerning the evil which the transgressor suffers, right? There's good things and bad things, rewards and punishments. So much confusion has invaded their opinions that it's almost impossible to find anyone whose opinion is uncontaminated by error. Maimonides, by the way, I forgot to mention, was very, very smart. And he knew he was very, very smart. And he didn't have much patience for people who were maybe not as smart as he was. So that writing comes through. It kind of makes it fun to read, though. So one group thinks that the good which you're going to get is the Garden of Eden, right? Houses are made of precious stones, beds of silk, rivers flow with wine and fragrant oils, and many other things like that. The evil is Gehenna, which is the Hebrew word for hell, right? There really was a hell in Jewish tradition. A place of raging fire in which bodies are burned and agonies of all sorts were inflicted on men. By the way, I should mention also, Maimonides is here only talking about Jews. These are different opinions held by Jews in his time, okay, in 12th century. A second group thinks that the good is the days of the Messiah. in whose time all men will be, you see where I'm reading from number 2 there? Okay. All men will be angels, and all of them will live forever. They'll be giants in stature. They'll grow in number and strength until they occupy the entire world forever. The Messiah will live forever. The earth will bring forth garments woven, bread baked, and many other impossible things. He is here telling you what he thinks about this idea, right? They are impossible. I should also add here, when I read Maimonides, I understand that he did not want to upset most Jews living at his time. So he wanted to write in a way that is somewhat disguising what he believes. So, but it doesn't take much reading into it to see that he doesn't really believe in what I call a supernatural messianic era, when bread grows on trees and so do garments. The evil is that a person won't be alive in those days and won't merit to see them. A third group holds that the good is resurrection of the dead. A man will live after his death, return to his family and dear ones, eat, drink, and never die again. The evil is you won't live to be resurrected. The fourth group says the goal is achieving bodily peace and mundane success. That's ordinary success, like fertile lands, extensive possessions, many children, health, peace, and security. There will be a Jewish king who will rule over those who oppressed us, or at least, let's say, rule over the land of Israel, where we're all going to go back. Right? This is a messianic era. And the evil is you won't be there to see that, or the present exile. This is a notice that I wrote in the margin there, Messiah version 2. This is a natural messianic era. The other was supernatural. This is natural messianic era. So there's 2 possible ideas about what the Messiah will bring. And the fifth group, which is the large one, combines the opinions of all the others. They assert the ultimate home is that the ultimate hope is that the Messiah will come, he'll resurrect the dead, who will enter the Garden of Eden, and will eat and drink in perfect health forever. Then he says, you will rarely find anyone to whom it occurs to think about this seriously or adopt it as a fundamental doctrine of faith or inquire what it really means. Right? So now I'm going to explain it to you, Maimonides says. Now let me tell you what's really going on. Okay, so turn the page. He says, now he's kind of making fun of most people who aren't really thinking seriously about this. So he says, what everybody wants to know is, how are the dead going to rise? Will they be naked or clothed? I mean, it'd be embarrassing if I was resurrected and I'm naked. I don't want to do that. So, I want to know that I'm going to wear clothes when I'm resurrected. Or am I going to be wearing the same shrouds that I was buried in? I want to wear a nice tux or a suit, I don't want to wear the burial shrouds that I was buried in. They want to know whether when the Messiah comes, there will still be rich or poor men, weak or strong men, and similar things. These he considers silly questions. And here again, he's hinting that there are more serious questions, but he doesn't tell you what they are. So let me suggest a couple. Number one, if you were married and then your spouse dies, God forbid, and then you remarry, and everybody's resurrected, who are you married to? Or, and that is what you say, well, that's only going to be a few people. Well, a few, maybe a million people, but okay, or how about this? What age do you get resurrected at, right? Because the 2 logical places to get resurrected are as infants, in which case, who takes care of the billions of infants, because they're going to need people to change their diapers? Or we get resurrected at the age we died. Not too many people want to come back at the age of 100. And if you pick any age in between those 2 points, it's kind of arbitrary. So how did you figure out what age you're coming back at? These are questions that I would consider serious questions. He doesn't even ask them. But in any case, I assume that he was aware of them, though. Okay, so now he's going to give you an analogy. And I'm going to summarize this, basically. He says, look, if you were a child and you're coming to learn how to read for the first time, many children don't want to learn how to read unless they get bribed, right? So you teach them the alphabet and you give them a cookie, right? And then that encourages them to learn. When they get older, cookies aren't going to do it anymore, so now you give them, let's say, a pair of shoes. So when they get a little older, a pair of shoes doesn't do it anymore, so you give them money, right? So this is the kind of stages that he goes through in explaining how as people develop, they still need to get rewarded for doing something. And he says, the problem is that the child and later the adult doesn't realize that learning is a value in itself. You should learn because you want to become wise, because the more you know about God's world, the better life you'll live, the more enlightened you'll be. And that's inherently good. But because people don't understand the inherent goodness of this, you have to bribe them with some kind of a bribe. And then he says on the right column, all of this is deplorable. However, it's unavoidable because of man's limited insight, as a result of which he makes the goal of wisdom something other than wisdom itself, and assumes that the purpose of study is the acquisition of honor, which makes a mockery of truth. Our sages called this learning not for its own sake, right? So you should learn because you want to become wise and you want to become enlightened. Okay, so let's turn the page. Where are we at now? 406. So I'm on the left side, the first full paragraph, and just again the underlined part. Should you be tempted to say, I will study Torah in order to become rich, or in order to be called a rabbi, little dig at rabbis, or in order to receive a reward in the world to come, Scripture teaches, love the Lord your God. Whatever you do, do it only out of love. And I think if you take home nothing else from this evening, I think this is like a key point for Maimonides. The reason for being good is because you love God, period, full stop. No rewards, no punishment, just do it because you have a creator who created you to live a good life, and so you're thankful for your life, and to show your gratitude, you be good. So do whatever you do, you should do it out of love for God. And then he says, in classic Maimonides style, only a disturbed fool whose mind is deranged by folly and by fantasy will refuse to recognize this truth. Right? However, our sages knew that this is a very difficult goal to achieve. Not everyone could achieve it. Men do not do anything except to achieve profit or to avoid loss. By the way, gender, I'm just using men because that's the translation here, but it's gender neutral, really, right? Of course. What? Okay, so therefore, now this is the most astonishing thing he's going to say. So pay close attention. I underlined it, put 2 exclamation marks. The most astonishing thing in this article, therefore, in order that the masses stay faithful and do the commandments, it was permitted to tell them that they might hope for a reward and to warn them against transgression for fear of punishment. Right? He's almost telling you there is no such thing, but you can tell them that so that they're good. After all, he says, they lose nothing when they do the commandments out of fear of punishment and out of hope for reward, since they're not perfect. And out of this effort, they may be awakened to the knowledge of the truth and come to serve God out of love. Right? But at least they're moving in the right direction, and then eventually they'll be doing things for the right reason. So now he's going to go on another digression, which I'll summarize. He says, our sages, the sages of the Talmud, spoke in parables. I'm just going to paraphrase this. So when they say something that doesn't sound scientifically possible, there's one of 3 ways to interpret it. Number 1, you take them literally. They really believe this impossible thing. And then he says, if you believe that, and that's what makes them wise, he says, you're stupid, because the sages would not believe impossible things. The second group says, oh yes, they meant these impossible things, and they were stupid. The sages were stupid, and that's why they said crazy things like this. And he says that group is even worse than the first group. And then, are you with me so far? And the third way to interpret the sages is they were speaking in parables. So anytime they say something that sounds unscientific, they didn't mean it literally. You have to look at it figuratively, right? That's an important point to make, because then he's going to interpret all rabbinic literature with this idea. Impossible things are impossible, and the sages would not have believed it. They must be talking in parables. They're giving you metaphors. They're not speaking literally. That's the next point he makes. And now we can skip. But by the way, so I gave you the handout so you can read this all on your own if you want to. I'm just summarizing it for you, but the material is here for you to read at your leisure. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next page, which is, okay. So just to give you again a little bit of his sharp language, at the bottom on the left side, the third group, the group that understands the sages speak in parables, the third group, its members are so few in number that it's hardly appropriate to call them a group, except in the sense that one speaks about the Son as a group. In other words, there's only one person out there who understands this, and that's me. Maybe not quite so much, but there's very few people who understand it this way. And what is that? It's that they speak in parables. All students, I'm on the right side where it says the first full paragraph, all students of rhetoric know the real concern of a riddle is with its hidden meaning and not with its obvious meaning. Since the words of the sages all deal with supernatural matters, which are ultimate, they must be expressed in riddles and analogies, right? So that's where he summarizes that idea. Okay, now we can turn to the next page. Now, if you, dear reader, the top of the page on the left side, if you belong to either of the first two groups, you think the sages meant what they said literally and either make fun of them or believe them, then pay no attention to the following words, what I'm going to say, because it's only going to irritate you. But if you are in the third group, and you encounter a word of the sages which seems to conflict with reason, then realize that this utterance must be a riddle and a parable, and if you consider my book in this spirit, with the help of God, it may be useful to you. Okay, now we're going to do one more analogy, and the analogy is this. He says, a blind man, how would you explain to somebody who is blind from birth what color is? What is red? What is blue? What is yellow? How would you describe that to someone who's never been able to use his eyes, right? A blind person can't really understand color. Similarly, a fish, and remember in Maimonides' time there were 4 elements, fire, water, air, and earth. And fire and water are opposites. So fish live in water. So he says, how would you explain to a fish what fire is, since fire can't exist in his world, right? So that is the kind of problem we have as human beings living in a 3-dimensional world, trying to understand what the afterlife is. It doesn't exist in a 3-dimensional world, and it's impossible for us to really get, just like we can't explain to a fish what fire is, right? So that's his next point that he's trying to make here. So let's see. So he explains it a little bit with the riddles and the right column toward the bottom of the page, where it says, in the world to come, our souls, do you see that part? Our souls will become wise out of the knowledge of God our Creator. This spiritual delight is not divisible into parts, nor can it be described, nor can any analogy explain it. Whatever the afterlife is, it's going to be in this alternate universe, alternate dimension. You will be intimately connected with God, your Creator. That is the ultimate pleasure and delight of your soul. I can't tell you anything more about it, because how could I possibly describe it? I don't even know. I haven't been there. I don't know what it is. I can't, and I certainly don't have the words to put it into language. So that's his point there, 4:11. So now we're going to go to 4:12. And now he's going to tell you what he thinks about the afterlife and heaven and hell. So here's the answers. The ultimate goal, I put that in the box. The ultimate goal, the final end, is to achieve this supernal fellowship, to participate in this high glory in which the soul is forever involved with the existence of God, the Creator, who is the source and cause of our existence and its goal. This is incomparably good. Your soul craves this intimate connection with God all your life, and we can only get a glimpse of it because we're in this 3-dimensional world. But in the afterlife, you will be intimately plugged into God, the Creator, and the source of everything. And that's going to be like the ultimate, experience for your soul. It's what your soul really craves. The utterly evil punishment, on the other hand, consists in cutting off the soul so it perishes and doesn't live eternally. That's the penalty of karet, which is described in the Talmud. Karet means being cut off. So here he's saying that being cut off means your soul dies with your body and doesn't exist anymore. And that is a terrible punishment for your soul, because what your soul really craved was a connection to God, and it will never get it. Okay? So that's what he says. It follows, and this is a key point, it follows that if a person has deliberately and regularly chosen physical delights, has despised the truth, loved falsehoods, right? If you torture your soul in this world, you're cruel and mean, and you do all kinds of bad things. You know, when you do something bad, most of us feel bad about it, right? So when you do something bad, that's like torturing your soul, right? When you don't learn, you don't engage your mind, you're torturing your soul. All these things cause your soul to shrivel up, Maimonides would say. On the other hand, when you do good things, you feel good about it. That nourishes your soul. When you enlighten yourself, you get these aha moments. That's nourishing your soul. Your soul grows stronger and stronger. And so, he says, it follows that if a person has deliberately chosen physical delights, despised the truth, and so on, he's going to be cut off from that high level of being and remain disconnected matter, right? On the other hand, if you nourish your soul, you will live forever in this connection with God. And now I just want to go back one moment and go back to what he said before about reward and punishment. He said, we're allowed to tell people about rewards and punishment, and it seemed almost like he was saying there isn't really any reward and punishment at all, but we can just tell people so they behave. But what I think he's saying here is, and this is a fine distinction perhaps, what he's describing as olam haba, the afterlife, is not really a reward. It's a natural consequence of how you lived your life. The natural result of having lived your life is that your soul was strengthened to the point where it can live outside your body. The natural consequence of torturing your soul is that it dies. So it's not, a reward is an artificial benefit you get. The chocolate or the cookie that you gave to the kid has nothing to do with the kid learning. It's just you made the association by giving the kid the cookie. It's artificial. Here he's saying it's a natural consequence. So that's what he says. Now take a look, and I'm going to sum up here in 2 more minutes. So the Garden of Eden, how much time do I have here? Oh, okay, right about time. Okay. The Garden of Eden is a fertile place containing the choicest of the earth's resources, numerous rivers and fruit-bearing trees. God will show it to us someday, right? If he knew about Bali, he'd say that was it, right? Or whatever your favorite desert or tropical island is, right? A lush place. It's a great place, but it's just a nice place. Gehenna, what is hell? That's the name for the pain and punishment which will come upon the wicked. No specific description of this is given in the Talmud. One teacher says the sun will come so close it'll burn the wicked. Others say it's a strange heat, blah, blah. What does Maimonides say? Nothing. Again, he doesn't want to upset the Jews who believe in fire and brimstone. But he already told you what the punishment is. Your soul is cut off. No fire, no brimstone, your soul just dies. Right? But he doesn't want to say that, so he kind of, in my opinion, he distracts you. Okay, then finally, resurrection of the dead, and this is the key thing, is one of the cardinal principles taught by Moses, our teacher. A person who does not believe in this principle has no real religion, certainly not Judaism. But does he answer any of the questions about it? No. He just says, oh, you have to believe it. And then the days of Messiah, I'll leave you to read that on your own. He basically believes in a natural messianic era, not the supernatural messianic era. And I noted all the elements of what that time period will look like. And if you go to the very end of his essay on page 412, the 11th principle is that God rewards those who follow the commandments and punishes those who transgress them. The greatest reward is the world to come. The worst punishment is extinction, right? He already told you that. The 12th principle is the Messianic era, right? Again, a naturalistic time, but we're not waiting for him. We know that it's going to come sometime. And the 13th principle is resurrection of the dead, which we've already explicated. Did he explain it? No, not really. He didn't really explain it. So this left people with the question, does he really believe in resurrection of the dead, and how does that fit with his idea about Olam Haba, the world to come? And so that created a controversy about whether Maimonides in fact believed in resurrection or not. And now I turn the microphone over to Rabbi Gelman, who will answer that question.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. So, Rabbi Morgen, tell us again when the Rambam wrote this Perush HaMishnayot, this commentary on his Mishnah.
Right. So he wrote this in 1166 to 1168. He was about 30 years old.
Okay. And the letter we're going to read, he wrote in approximately 1191. So what's interesting, just to point out as we go through this, is the material that you just studied with Rabbi Morgen is some of his earliest material, right? And it's quite possible that this is his last thing he wrote, the thing that I'm sharing with you, that it's the last of his major works. So really, one could argue that at the bookends of Maimonides' life, he's dealing with this issue. It's something that dogged him his entire life, or at least his entire life as a public intellectual, if you will. And we'll see why that's going to be important as we go through this letter. So I'll just basically, before we get to the actual text of the letter, a few notes. First of all, this, as opposed to his other writings, though we do see some sarcasm and some biting character in the commentary on the Mishnah that we saw. Most of Maimonides' works are very impersonal and dry. They're works of halakha and works of philosophy. This letter that we are going to read is very personal. The Rambam is angry. He actually feels that writing this letter is a huge waste of his time. And he's annoyed and feels that the requirement to write it is based on him being misunderstood, based on a witch hunt. He feels like he's being treated like a rabbi, essentially, unfairly and misunderstood. So that's important to know as we read it. It's also possible to read this letter as Rambam's admission that he has failed at one of the greatest or the greatest project in his life. One of the things that Rambam focused on in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide to the Perplexed, and in the essay that you just studied with Rabbi Morgen, is to try to move people away from the notion of serving God for reward. And he wanted to move people towards serving God out of love, me'ahava, as the Rambam calls it. And if one is going to be focused on the resurrection of the dead as a reward, and if that's what people are really focused on, it means that they're not focused on serving God simply because it's the right thing to do. And so his need to write a whole letter about what resurrection of the dead means at the end of his life, you could imagine bothered him terribly, because that wasn't what was important to him. That's what we call serving God from yir'ah, from fear of punishment or from fear of not being rewarded. While Maimonides was interested in a much purer type of service of God. So it's sad in a way that the last thing that the Rambam has to write is essentially an admission that the people that he was talking to weren't listening or weren't ready for his message. There's another layer which we'll get to a little bit later. This essay on resurrection consists of 3 parts. The first part explains how some readers of his earlier works, like the one you just studied, became confused and began to claim that that Maimonides did not believe in resurrection of the dead. And it's fun in these sort of debates to try to find some difference between the two speakers. So I think Rabbi Morgen will argue that Maimonides really did not believe in resurrection of the dead. And I could argue that in this essay that Maimonides, in fact, did believe in resurrection of the dead, although he felt it was really unimportant and a step down from the ultimate, which is for the soul to be basking in God's glory. So the first is about trying to convince is that people made a mistake. Then he defends himself against this accusation, and finally, in the end, he talks about the biblical verses that would lead us to believe that there is no resurrection of the dead, and some discussion about those biblical verses that Maimonides uses to defend the belief in the resurrection, in the resurrection of the dead. So I think it's let's jump into the text itself, and we'll see a few key parts, and then we will have time for some discussion and questions and answers. Just one other important note is that the Rambam, since he was not really interested in furthering this notion of reward and punishment in the physical sense, what Maimonides has to do throughout his writings is look at all the verses in the Bible, and there are many of them, that do talk about reward and punishment, and explain them in a particular manner. And this is a beautiful move that Maimonides makes. He looks at many of the verses that talk about reward and punishment and say it's true, it's unavoidable that these verses are in the Torah, but that is not they are not an end of themselves. So whatever peace and prosperity may come because of the good works that we do are only a means to be able to serve God further, because if there's no war and there's no poverty and there's no hunger, then I don't have to spend my time dealing with those things. I could spend my time doing the mitzvot, the commandments. I could spend my time philosophizing about God. I could spend my time thinking about what it means to bask in the glory of God. So even though the Torah does speak about reward and punishment, that is just a means to a much greater end, right? Those rewards are not the end of themselves. They just serve my desire to be able to serve God uninterrupted by impeachment hearings and, presidential debates and things like that, right? So if the world was just running smoothly, I wouldn't have to worry about any of those things. All right, so let's jump right into it. The text you have, it's the other one, not the first one you studied. There's a letter A and a B on the front page. Does anyone not have that? Okay, fantastic. So Maimonides first... what he does something here which is very, very clever. In letter A, it is not rare that a person aims to expound the intent of some conclusions clearly and explicitly, makes an effort to reject doubts and eliminate far-fetched interpretations, and yet the unbalanced will draw the reverse judgment of the conclusions he sought to clarify. He says, so even though I'm annoyed, and we'll see it clearly throughout the letter, that I have to write this letter, it's not so rare that someone tries to say something which is very, very clear, and some unbalanced people will misread it. And he says, I'm in good company. Now, who do you think he's saying he's in good company with? God. He's in good company with God because God said some such thing occurred even to one of God's declarations. When the chief of the prophets, Moses, wished by the order of God to teach us that he, with a capital H, is one, without associates, and to remove from our hearts those wrong doctrines that the dualists propound, he proclaimed this fundamental Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, right? The Lord is our God, the Lord alone, or the Lord is one. But the Christians utilize this verse to prove that God is one of three, teaching that the Lord, our God, the Lord, make three names, right? The trilogy, all followed by one, which indicates that they are three and that the three are one. Far be God from what they say in their ignorance. If this is what happened to God's proclamation, it is much more likely to be expected to happen to statements by humans. So this is just so clever. The Rambam says, all right, it's not me, it's you. And the reason I know it's not me and it's you is because you all, meaning people, you did it to God. And so I shouldn't be surprised that I wrote clearly, or at least he claims he wrote clearly in the piece that you just studied with Rabbi Morgen, that I believe in the resurrection of the dead, but somehow it got misinterpreted, but that's okay because even God gets misinterpreted. Then he goes on to say, if you don't like what I'm writing, that's okay. My object was to find favor with God, not to look forward to honor and reward from people. He was a little getting to the end of his life at this point, a little antisocial, I guess. Okay, so one of the reasons I think that Maimonides did not want to focus on the resurrection of the dead and instead focused more of his attention on Olam Haba, the soul's reunion with God, is because remember I said before, one of the main projects of Maimonides' life is to move people away from serving God out of fear towards serving God out of love. One of his second projects was to move people away from the belief that God had a physical manifestation. It was apparently a big problem in his day, even amongst Jews. It's interesting that it doesn't seem to me like a big problem. We have other problems. It doesn't seem that there's a lot of Jews running around thinking that God has an outstretched hand and nostrils that flare when he's angry, even though the Bible says that. We all have come to learn, largely thanks to Maimonides, that that's metaphorical. Dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of human beings. We need to tell the story, so we tell the story in human terms. But back in Maimonides' day, apparently lots of people thought this. So anything the Rambam could do to move away from the physical manifestation, he did. So he didn't even want to talk about the body returning to the soul returning to the body and the body living again. So on page 2, letter A, when I applied myself to this task, I realized that it was not correct to strive to explain the ramifications of the religious law and to leave its roots neglected, unexplained, and its essentials undiscussed, providing no guidance. This is especially urgent, since I have met some who think that they are among the sages of Israel. By God, they indeed know the way of the law ever since childhood, and they battle in legal discussions, but they are not certain if God is corporeal with eyes, hands, and feet, as the Bible says, or if he is not a body. Others whom I have met in some lands assert positively that he is corporeal and call anyone who thinks differently a non-believer. Name him a heretic and an Epicurean. Rabbi Morgen introduced you to the Apikorsim, the Epicurean also. So it's the opposite. Not right now, who would we call the one with mistaken theological beliefs? The one who believes that God has a body. Back in the day, Maimonides was saying there were great Torah sages who he admits knew halacha, but they would call anyone who claimed that God did not have a body to be a heretic. So Maimonides really tries to move away from that. He says, I concluded it was necessary that I clearly elucidate religious fundamentals in my works on law. I determined not to teach these basic truths in the idiom of inquiry, since the examination of these roots requires skills in many fields, of which, as I pointed out in the guide, the learned in the Torah know nothing. Again, Rambam is very certain of his abilities. More than anything else, I prepared to have the truths accepted by the masses. I therefore published principles that need to be acknowledged in the introduction to the commentary of the Mishnah regarding prophecy, etc. And there too, he says, I expounded fundamentals concerned with the beginning and the end, i.e. what pertains to God's unity in the world to come, and the other tenets of Torah. I acted the same way in my major work, which I called Mishnah Torah. So the Rambam here is explaining why he spent so much time on these philosophical ideas, basically because people were getting them wrong. And he also said in that same work, I did talk about and said that one of the 13 principles of faith is that the soul will return to the body and bodies would live again. But then he writes on the bottom of that page, on the right side, I thereupon announced very clearly that the resurrection is a fundamental of the Torah of Moses our master, but that it was not the ultimate goal, that the ultimate goal is life in the world to come. I engaged in this long discussion so that I dispelled a serious skepticism. So Maimonides' point here is very straightforward. Why would I spend time talking about the resurrection of the dead, which I believe in, when there's something much better and much more important, and that is Olam Haba, when the soul basks in the glory of God. That's the ultimate, that's what we're shooting for. That's our ultimate goal. So that's what I want to spend time about. He also says elsewhere, which we'll just talk about outside, is another reason is because it's very easy to visualize resurrection. I'm going to come back in my clean socks and my nice shirt, and I'll walk the earth again. But it's very hard to understand Olam Haba. What does that mean? That the soul is going to live with God and going to bask in God's glory. What does that mean? So that, he says, is what requires our time and our intellectual energy. And that's why I spend so much time over my life talking about that and not talking about this. And this is why I'm really angry that at the end of my life, I have to spend time talking about this. That's a point the Rambam makes a little bit later, but we saved time by just mentioning it outside. Okay, let's turn to page 5. I'm sorry, this got a little garbled. The meaning of the resurrection, I declare, letter A, which is popular and well known in our community, and all our peers agree on it, is the return, page 5? I'm sorry about that. Is the return of the soul to the body after separation. It is very frequently recalled in the prayers, sermons, supplications. So again, he's saying it's all over the place. You didn't need me for this to be a fundamental belief. This is all over the place. And then what the Rambam does, and here some people say that this is the Rambam's attempt to downplay resurrection. He asks a rhetorical question. He says, he makes a point. If you don't believe, he argues, in resurrection, then you also shouldn't believe in any of the other miracles that are in the Torah. It's clearly a miracle, resurrection. So Maimonides says there's nothing special about it. There's something special about Olam Haba, about the soul living with God. But there's nothing special about resurrection. It's a miracle like any other miracles. Bodies have decomposed, there's nothing left of them, and all of a sudden they're back. So he doesn't even it's not even a separate category. It's a miracle like any other miracle. And he says that on page 6. What I do deny and disown before God is any assertion that the soul will never return to the body and that it simply cannot happen. This kind of rejection leads to the rejection of all the miracles. The denial of miracles is a denial of God and a defection from the law. Absolutely nothing in all that I have written suggests that I deny the return of the soul to the body. On the contrary, it suggests the opposite. And some scholars of Maimonides, and I'm working off some comments by David Hartman, make another point. It's not that Rambam needs to prove that the resurrection is possible. All he needs to tell us is that you can't disprove that it will happen. And what's his reasoning? Well, it's a miracle. And God, if it's part of our tradition, and he says it's in all the sermons and all the prayers and all the teachings, you have to convince me that it can't happen. And you can't convince me that it can't happen. Because if you're going to try to convince me that it can happen, you also have to convince me that the splitting of the sea can't happen, and that the manna that traveled with the Jewish people, their magical food, can't happen, and that the clouds of glory can't happen, and that the Hanukkah oil didn't last for 8 days can't happen. Right? If it's just a function of miracles, I don't have to prove to you that it will happen. All I have to do is leave some reasonable doubt or some reasonable belief that it can happen, and that's easy because God does lots of miraculous things, and he can do this as well. On the bottom of that page, you surely know that the fundamentals of God's unity, the Lord is one, is not repeated in the Torah, since I found the prophetic statement not susceptible to interpretation, which speaks of the return of the soul to the body. The prophetic announcement is herewith made. And then he goes on to say, and if you're looking for a verse, as Rabbi Morgen said, there's a verse in Daniel, and that's all I need, one verse. We only have one verse about God's unity. That's a key, right? That's what he says on the bottom. You surely know that the fundamental of God's unity, the Lord is one, is not repeated in the Torah. We just have it once. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And we do have it maybe in the Ten Commandments, but it's not the most fundamental principle of Judaism. Is not mentioned over and over and over again. All I need is one verse, the book of Daniel. That's all I need. And then he says, repeating something which is true many times over doesn't make it more true, and denying something which is true many times over doesn't make it less true. So why are we all upset that the Bible doesn't have so many verses that explicitly talk about this? We only need one that talks about God's unity. We only need one that talks about the resurrection of the dead. We'll just make one or two points here, and then I guess we could open it up for discussion. Let's turn to page 8, letter B. Oh, just on top of that letter A, where Rabbi Morgen raised, how are we coming back? Like children, like adults, who we marry to? Maimonides says, none of this makes a difference in the way we practice Judaism, so I'm not dealing with it. When it happens, it happens. Then we'll know. Then we'll know the answer. But it doesn't matter at this point, because it doesn't help me, light my Shabbos candles better, and I don't need to know that to light one Hanukkah candle on the first night and not 8 Hanukkah candles on the first night. And since it's not important, what's important to that is that it's a fundamental of faith. You should believe it. But whether or not you're going to come back, at your weight that you were at your wedding or on your 20th anniversary, that doesn't concern me, because that is, I'm just speaking to myself, by the way, and letting you listen. That doesn't concern me because none of it is practical. And in letter B on page 8, it occurs to me that what has made the people be in error about my views on resurrection is the difference in treatment. When I dealt with the world to come, I dealt at great length and in detail on the description, elucidated its essence, where the underline is. But when I wrote the resurrection, I disposed of it in a few words, asserting that it is a valid, fundamental. 2 considerations dictated this treatment. In the first place, all of my compositions are to the point and brief. I'm generally of few words. I do not seek to enlarge the size of books. And secondly, collaboration is to be applied only in the comprehension of a hidden matter, so that it's achieved or its verity is proved. But again, you don't need to do this with the resurrection of the dead, because it's not a hidden matter. It's a miracle. Like any other miracles, if you have trouble believing in this, you have bigger problems than just not believing in the resurrection of the dead. We've already covered the fact that it's not talked about in the Torah explicitly, but in letter B on page 9, the answer to the first question is, in my opinion, that the discourses of the prophets and the texts of the hagiographa mean only to portray the customary familiar pattern of existence. Again, the reason that it's not in the Torah is because I don't need it to live a Jewish life. I have to believe in it, but I don't need the details of it. It is not in the course of nature for the individual to return after his death and come into being a second time. That's something miraculous, and we'll deal with it. We'll deal with it when it happens. It reminds me of the funny story of someone goes to the fictitious prime minister of Israel and says, "How could you take so much money from Christians? They believe that Jesus, the Messiah, came already and then left, and we believe he hasn't come yet." And so the prime minister says, "Look, when Messiah comes, I'm going to ask him, is this your first time here or your second time here? But until then, I'm going to take the money." So Maimonides is saying the same thing. When we get resurrected, then we'll know all the details. We don't need to know the details now. And finally, he says on page 10, you must understand that the denial of the belief in the return of the soul of the body is positively rooted in one of 2 reasons. The repudiation may arise because it is contrary to nature. If so, all miracles must be refused, like we said, because they are also contrary to nature. Or the denial comes because it is not stated in the text, and there are no authentic traditions regarding it, and there are for other miracles. However, I demonstrated that there are texts, even if few, confirming the return of the dead. If one should object that he reinterprets these passages as he does others, my answer is that what impels you to reinterpret them is that the resurrection is contrary to nature, so that you will explain the passages and make them conform to natural phenomenon. But for this reason, you must reinterpret the changes of the rod to a serpent, to the falling of the manna, etc. Right? You can't pick and choose about what you're going to reinterpret. And so these are some of Maimonides' claims, the Rambam's claims about resurrection of the dead. He does say a few times in here that I believe, with perfect faith, so to speak, right, that the soul will be reconstituted with the body, and this is the sort of the last word, if you will, that the Rambam leaves on the matter. And at the end, he says on page 12, no intelligent person has the right to blame me for the repetition in this essay, the addition to the main idea, or for the extensive clarification of what does not really require further light. I wrote this tract only for the common people who had begun to doubt what I had stated explicitly. And for those who reproached me for brevity when I spoke of the resurrection. Those who are truly learned are satisfied with a suggestion. They need neither repetition nor prolonged exegesis, etc. And in the middle of the essay, he gives the history of it, and then I'm really going to be finished. In the middle of the essay, he gets to why he's doing this, and it is on page 4. He notes that in 1185, he got a letter from Yemen about this, and then it really broke in 1191. A letter arrived from some of my colleagues in Baghdad. There was a rabbi bad-mouthing me about that I don't believe, and people got upset about it. And so he finally decided. So for 6 years, he actually ignored the first accusation, but then he decided, as he was getting older, perhaps this is just conjecture on my part, that he couldn't let it go, that his legacy was going to be what it was. So did the Rambam believe in resurrection of the dead? He certainly gives it short shrift up until the very end of his life, until he spends 20 pages on it. He says he believes in it, but there are people who even read into this essay that he's just trying to make people happy and stop the Jewish world from blowing up about it. So, but this may actually literally be Rambam's last word, not only on resurrection, but on anything Jewish.
Okay. So now I think we have some opportunity for questions. So questions? Yeah, Dan. I will repeat the question so people can hear.
The first thing to repeat is he said he enjoyed it. So that's that's it. Just sit down. That's all we needed.
Okay, so in Rabbi's youth, he said something about that people who thought that when Messiah comes, that all righteous Jews will
Live forever.
now experience this new era of peace and blah, blah, blah. That's what I was actually, I learned. I learned it. That's what was suggested in my class. Now at the end of his life, he says that it's your soul pleading with God. So it seems to me like you could deduce from that at the end of his life, Maimonides also didn't believe in the Messianic era. Not only did he not believe in physical resurrection, but he must not have believed in the Messiah. And I know that's not to be true. So he did. So I'm trying to figure out why.
So let me see if I can repeat the question. So you were saying that in the beginning, in the essay on the Mishnah, he talks about the Messianic era where righteous people will bask in God's glory and eat and drink and all that. So and then Olam Haba, he's talking about Olam Haba. Well, I think he talks about Olam Haba throughout his life. He talks about both throughout his life. So he talks about both in the commentary on the Mishnah, and he talks about both in the treatise on resurrection, about Olam Haba, the afterlife, the spiritual afterlife, and the resurrection of the dead. By the way he reconciles these ideas is, in the treatise, I believe he says that, you go to this spiritual afterlife. When the Messianic era happens, there will be a resurrection, so you're going to briefly come back to earth in your body, but it's not going to last very long, maybe a month or two, and then you're going to go back to the spiritual afterlife and bask in God's glory again. And what was the purpose of being resurrected then for a month or two? Just to prove that it could be done. Did I get that about right? So in other words, God's going to do this miracle just to prove that God can do miracles, and then you're going to go back and enjoy the real reward, which the 69 Mets, right? That's true. I forgot about that. Yeah, the other real miracle. Okay, but I think he believes in both, and that's how he kind of tries to reconcile them in the treatise on resurrection. Yeah.
Just comment. The Rambam in that piece, he comes out believing, and he writes this elsewhere, in a very natural messianic era. Right? Lo yisagoya goy cherev, we'll all beat our swords into plowshares, and that is an order. Like I said earlier, that the Messianic era is not an end in itself. The Messianic era is even so that now we'll have all this time to study Torah, right? And so the Messianic era is something very physical. It's here. Olam haba, people are going to die continue to die even once the Messiah comes, and then they go to Olam haba.
Again, some of them for the second time.
Right, some for the second time, and some who were alive at the Messianic era for the first time will just die and go to Olam haba.
Right. Yes, Lily. Right, so the question is, does he talk about whether you'll experience loved ones in Olam haba or not? I don't know that he...
Olam haba is a completely non-physical, it's a soul existence. So that would not work. Your soul, no, he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't. It's very romantic, but I don't think he talks about it.
I would say this. This is my personal take on it, so this is not Maimonides' take on it. So look, I think the idea is if you can recognize God and you don't have a body and God doesn't have a body, so you may be able to recognize other souls even though they don't have bodies, right? So that's sort of, but Maimonides doesn't write about that. That I know of anyway. Yeah, Carol. Right. Right. So the question is why did he, if he doesn't, he protests in the essay itself that he doesn't really care what people think about him, right? He's just telling the truth, and he doesn't really, I'm just going to tell you the truth, and I don't care what you think about it because I'm just trying to be honest here and straightforward. And yet he seems to care a lot about it, right? He's very angry about it. So what was the deal? Was he concerned or was he not concerned about what other people thought about him and his work? And
I would like to actually, that's a great question. And this is if you want to read more about this, I highly recommend this book called The Epistles of Maimonides, Crisis in Leadership, translations of Maimonides' works by Abraham Halkin, and discussion by David Hartman. So published by JPS, Jewish Publication Society of Blessed Memory. I think it went out of business.
They're still there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They just using a different publishing house.
Oh, okay. In any case, this is exactly the question that Rabbi Hartman is dealing with, in the sense that Rabbi Hartman reads these letters as moments of great leadership by Maimonides. And despite the fact that Maimonides is feeling beaten down, he still writes this letter to try to teach people. I'll read you a brief paragraph from this. If the implication is that the essay on resurrection testifies to the failure of his life's work that I alluded to earlier, then one must read this essay as Maimonides' painful acknowledgement of the futility of the philosopher's return to the cave, right? We know that image. The philosopher, according to the Platonic metaphor, leaves the cave, wherein the community is captivated by mere shadows of true reality, ascends the ladder of philosophic knowledge, and beholds truth. The philosopher may then sever his ties to the community, or he may return to the cave in order to guide the community to follow the path leading to the true reality beyond the life dominated by the shadows. Maimonides had chosen the latter path. Although for him the ultimate state of human perfection and happiness consisted in knowledge and love of God, he remained aware that the halakha demands from every Jew a commitment to the community. In his earlier writings, he had therefore accepted the challenge of the Torah and sought to make love and knowledge of God not only a personal quest, but an orienting goal for the entire community. So I think what Hartman is saying is that Maimonides, he found the truth. And he realized that the masses had a hard time finding the truth. But he was still going to go for it. And at the end, he may admit that he wasn't able to get the people where he wanted to get them, but he felt he had an obligation to try, and so he did. And that may have frustrated him. It may have been less frustrating to leave everyone in the cave and him to go out on his merry way, but he didn't feel that he didn't have the right. He didn't have the right to do that.
Okay. Lou, did you have a question?
Rabbi Gelman, in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about that what Maimonides really wanted to do was to get people to love God and do things just out of love and not out of fear, in order to get to Olam. Was that in any way a reaction to Christianity and salvation?
So the question was that Maimonides wanted Jews to do things out of love for God and not for reward and punishment. And the question was whether that was a reaction to Christianity. In what way? I mean, Christianity teaches the same thing. You should do things because you love God. So,
Well, I think maybe Christianity does have, like you said, a more worked out heaven and hell.
that's true, right? Yeah.
I don't know if Maimonides was directly reacting to that. It seems from his writings that he had enough of Jewish problems on his hands. Now, it could be that the Jews had, he says it at one point, even the great Torah scholars may think that God has a body. That, we know where that comes from, right? And at the very beginning of the letter, he says, we have a verse in the Bible which to us explicitly teaches the unity of God, and the Christians came along and reinterpreted it to mean that there are three, which is one, and there's a physical manifestation of it to boot. So it could be that the Jews were sort of caught up in that, and Maimonides was trying to deal with misguided beliefs that the Jews had. But I don't know if he was directly, maybe indirectly, but I don't know if it was direct.
Yeah, well, he
right.
lived mostly in a Muslim world, so he's mostly concerned with Jews
But he
living
does
in the
mention
Muslim
Christianity
world.
in the beginning of the essay, so obviously, but you're right, most of his world was Muslim.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming tonight, and we're going to have some refreshments back there so we can keep the discussion going outside. Thank you for coming.